Chapter 10 is about preparing you to read more extended sentences in Greek and do more interesting things with your Greek. You saw the relative pronoun in the first part, so linking two sentences together when they've got a common noun between them. But now we're going to look at some slightly more interesting things you can do. The first is the slanted question. If we take these questions, what is your instinctive answer? You're only kidding, aren't you? I'm expecting you to say, of course I'm only kidding. So yes. Number 3. Surely you aren't so gullible as to think that, are you? No, of course I'm not. We are going to the theatre tonight, aren't we? Yes, it's tonight, not another night. Surely you don't think you'll actually win the lottery, do you? No, I'm not that foolish. I am going to get a present today, aren't I? Yes, of course you are, don't worry. We never meant that, did we? No, we never meant that. Well, let's look back at these a little. All the ones where I've said, aren't you, or don't you, or aren't I, have resulted in the answer yes. There's been a correspondence between the negative in that extra question and the answer yes. Conversely, everywhere we've had a positive, are you, do you, did we, you've got a negative in the answer. So a negative in the reinforcement leads to a positive answer, and a positive in the reinforcement leads to a negative answer. You'll also notice there's the use of the word surely. So surely with a not there and surely with a not there are also correlated with the no answer. If I said surely you're only kidding and put a surely in there, you would be able to see that led to yes. So surely not leads to the answer no, surely leads to the answer yes. So we have ways in English of leading you to what the expected answer to a question is. You use words like surely, you use reinforcing statements such as aren't you, do you, don't you, to give colour and tone to your basic question. This doesn't have to work though. Take the example in number 2. You do want some extra homework, don't you? Now, according to the pattern, that should result in the answer yes. But none of you are ever going to say yes, are you? You see, did it there? You're going to say, no, we really don't want any extra homework. But that's kind of the point. If you imagined me saying that, you can almost feel the tongue-in-cheekness of it. So we can also subvert the rhetoric of the implied answer. So this is a really useful English thing where you can use words like surely, surely not. You can use reinforcing statements like aren't you, don't you, do you, to lead a listener towards an implied answer and then allow them the space to subvert that answer as a rhetorical strategy in its own right. This is also something you can do in Greek. If you want to imply the answer no, then you're going to use the word mer in your question. If you want to imply the answer yes, then you're going to use oo in your question. So you've learned that you use oo with the indicative and mer everywhere else, but those are in normal, straightforward statements. If, however, you see it in a question, then you might want to think, is this a slanted question where I'm being directed towards an implied answer? This will be harder to spot with oo, as it may be just a basic question anyway. It should be relatively easy to spot with mer, because you won't otherwise get mer with an indicative. So if you see mer plus an indicative, it's worth checking, is it a question? Because often that will be what's going on, and that will explain why you've got this random mer in there. It's a slanted question, suggesting to the audience that the answer is really no. It's quite a subtle thing, but it does crop up with relative frequency in the New Testament. Slightly more straightforward to spot is indirect speech. Indirect speech is reported speech. One of the ways you could remember this is it uses what we call van verbs. This is a colleague of mine suggested this to me. And these are verbs above the neck, which is a loose term for anything to do with thinking, feeling, perceiving, noticing, realising, saying. Any of those verbs are going to trigger indirect speech. So we take the direct statement, the cat sat on the mat. Direct statement. You could turn that into, I said the cat sat on the mat, where you are now putting in speech marks. Or, I know that the cat sat on the mat, which is now indirect. So you've got a direct statement, a direct statement inside speech, and an indirect statement. Doing this in Greek is very straightforward. Let's take a phrase like the house is in a field, because this is now one you can do in Greek. Ho oikos estin en agro. We'll make it generic without an article for the agro. I tell you, lego, pros. You should know your pronouns now after last week. Prosse, we'll make them singular. And now you need a way to do your speech marks. You have 3 options in Greek. You can say the participle of lego, hoti, legon hoti. You can put any of those 3 things in, and all they're doing is implying speech marks. So if you were translating this, a word-for-word translation, I speak to you saying the house is in a field. I speak to you that the house is in the field, a field. I speak to you saying that the house is in a field. You could translate legon hoti, but all they're actually doing is saying, please put speech marks in. So good English would not translate them, it would be to put speech marks in. What you should see in the Greek is a capital letter next, editorially to say, there is speech here. So the capital letter isn't the marker of direct speech. Legon hoti, or finally actually nothing at all, just that capital letter reminding you that you've entered speech, mark that you've got direct speech. So this is direct quoted speech. You can then make that indirect. I tell you that the house is in a field. We no longer use the speech marks in English. We're using the word that instead. The same is true in Greek. So this would be lego pros se hoti ho oikos estin en agro. So you're still using hoti, but now you've not got a capital letter. You're not moving into direct speech. So hoti functions both to introduce speech marks and as an equivalent to the English word that when introducing indirect speech. Context will tell you which one of those you've got, but when you see hoti in the context of speech, you do need to stop and think, is this direct or is this indirect? There's one last thing to think about with speech, and that's what happens if you change tenses. If I change the tense of lego, I tell to I told, and in Greek that's going to be apon, so regular, we'll look at that in chapter 11. Apon prosse, I spoke to you, I said to you, hoti. Now, in English, I told you that the house blank in a field. We are now going to have to say was in there, reflecting the tense of told. But what did I tell you? The house is in a field. The content of the speech hasn't changed, it's the framing that's changed. And Greek decides not to care about the framing, but to maintain the tense of the content of the speech. So you're still going to say ho oikos, estin, en agro. This means you've now got a disconnect between the tense was in English and the tense estin, which is present in Greek. That is fine. You are providing natural English by saying was in English. Greek is providing natural Greek by using estin in Greek. But it will mean when you're translating it, you will have to shift tenses to write good English. So if you notice that you've got a hottie suggesting you've got some kind of indirect speech, stop and think, do I need to sort out my tenses here? This gives hottie three main meanings. You've got hottie meaning that in indirect speech, same as the English word. You've got hottie meaning speech marks in direct speech. You've got hottie meaning because as a separate word. And you might notice that because it's less likely to be in the context of any kind of word for speaking. So hottie has three key meanings in the New Testament, and particularly these two you need to be careful about because they're very similar. They're both going to be used in the context of speech, but one will be quoting speech and one will be reporting speech. There is one final use. Hottie can also mean whatever. Can be an indefinite relative. But that's not used very often in the New Testament, so we're going to bracket that off and not worry about it at this point. But for completeness' sake, there are 4 uses of the word hottie, 3 of which you will see fairly frequently. The last thing you need to think about are time expressions. When we looked at prepositions in chapter 4, we talked about space. The accusative gives you a sense of motion. The genitive gives you a sense of circularity, or possibly going away from and out of. And the dative gives you a point. So you had ways of expressing space using those cases, particularly after particular prepositions. A similar kind of thing happens with time. The different cases can be used just by themselves to express different kinds of time phrase. So the accusative answers the question, how long? How long were you walking for? I was walking for 3 days. Peripator tres hemeras. You've simply put 3 days into the accusative and you get for 3 days. You haven't used a word for. That for 3 days is a durational use of the word for, and that is expressed by the accusative in Greek. Genitive, when does Father Christmas come? During the night. He comes by night. We've not used any word for during, but you use the genitive of the word night. Now, you won't actually meet the genitive of the word night until chapters 12 and 13, but that's what it is. If we make it a day, then it'll be hemeras as the genitive. And finally, the dative gives you a point. So accusative gives you time how long. The genitive gives you time during which. And the dative gives you time when. When did he arrive? He arrives, or he arrived. I'll tell you what the past tense that is now. You'll meet it in chapter 11. Elthe. He came on the 5th day. Pempter hemera. 5th day on the 5th day. Again, we've not used a word for on, that is conveyed by use of the dative. Notice that in the accusative, you've got a number 1, 2, 3, a cardinal number. In the dative, you've got an ordinal number, first, second, third, in this case, fifth. And that helps you see the difference between the duration. The accusative is giving you how long you've got to count it on your fingers. The dative gives you a point, so it's got to be a one-off, which gives you a ranking one, so an ordinal one. So that can be help sometimes a sign that this is what you're dealing with, because you may find you suddenly got these kinds of numbers floating around. It's not definite, you haven't got one there in the genitive in this example, but it can happen. So cases give you a way of expressing time. The accusative will tell you how long something lasts. Jesus fasted in the desert for 40 days and 40 nights. When did the robber come? He came during the night, in the genitive. And on the third day he rose again. We'll be using the dative. You can see that these are very useful ways of, particularly in the Gospels, describing everyday life, but even the letters giving you a framework in which things happen temporally. So these are common in Greek. I suggest you make sure you have some kind of document or piece of paper or set of charts or set of cards that you are keeping a list of different ways of using the cases, and that you now add these temporal uses to that list. So the accusative, how is it used in space? How is it used after main verbs? How is it used after prepositions? And how is it used for time? And we'll continue to build on all of those as we go through the book.